Make sure your insurance doesn't come up short. Get gap cover with ALA. For more information, follow the links in the description.
Hello everybody. Today I am driving a car that automotive journalists would have you believe is utterly and completely brilliant. Yet, this is also the kind of car that makes me doubt the credibility of my fellow journalists. Why is that, and what exactly is this? Well, this is the Aston Martin V8 Vantage F1 Edition. I'm James, and this is JayEmm on Cars. So, before we get started proper today, I wish to say simply a big thank you to everybody that's been watching my content and supporting the channel over the last 9 years. It's been an incredible journey, and I have absolutely no intention of stopping anytime soon. And if you've enjoyed either this video or any of my others that you've seen and you haven't yet subscribed, please do hit that button, tick the bell icon if you wish to be notified of every new video from me. I make 3 a week. They cost you nothing to watch, but ticking that box would really make a big difference to me, and I'd be eternally grateful. Anyway, on with the fun stuff. Now, it is no stretch to say that the 2018 Aston Martin Vantage did not get off to the best of starts. It had a near impossible task, replacing a much-loved car which had become an icon in its own lifetime, the 2005 Vantage, known to many as the baby Aston. This was the car that for the first time gave a credible alternative to the Porsche 911, only with a bit of British class, a banging soundtrack and a sumptuous interior, all wrapped up in an indescribably gorgeous package which now, 20 years after it was launched, still looks the bee's knees. The 2018 car, meanwhile, was a slightly odd, ungainly affair with a big gaping grille at the front that nobody liked on launch. It had a Cortex steering wheel, helping to draw comparisons with another great British failure, the Aston Allegro. But perhaps worst of all, here you had an engine and infotainment that were taken from the Germans. Now, there's nothing fundamentally really that wrong with the 4-litre bi-turbo Mercedes V8. It's a very, very good engine. Now, I've never been the biggest fan of the 4-litre because I feel it's just a little bit laggy and has neither the response or the punch of the 5.5-litre bi-turbo or the character and zing of the 6.2-litre naturally aspirated lump. However, you cannot deny it makes the numbers and it does the business. The old naturally aspirated Aston V8 was beginning to show its age, and every time it turned up in a group test, you couldn't help but feel a little bit sorry for it, because even when new, it was a little bit underpowered. A decade and a half later, you got the inevitable feeling that whenever it turned up in a group test, Aston had brought a knife to a gunfight. But it was this infotainment that I think so frustrated everybody. Not only because it was Mercedes sourced, but because it was old Mercedes tech. It really did feel a little bit like a Falterback were giving Aston their table scraps, and apparently they in return were supposed to be grateful. This bit down here, meanwhile, I'm the first person to say that I do not like touch buttons and displays to control stuff in a car. But this is not what I meant by let's have buttons instead. This is ill thought out, not particularly intuitive, and certainly nowhere near as nice to look at as the old setup. And even worse, if you were the sort of person that used your car day to day, the last of the old V8 and V12 Vantage had things like Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. The new one did not. So in a great many ways, it felt like a real step back. And you could tell customers just were not enthused. These failed to shift. It then got to the point where Aston Martin did a deal a few years back where you could have a new or nearly new V8 Vantage for just £1,000 down and £1,000 a month on a 24-month deal. They pay your road fund license and they pay your servicing too. Now that was a deal too good to be true. But it actually was true. Unfortunately, I got to the party a little bit too late. And it turned out, maybe not surprisingly, the only reason they'd ever done that deal is because they needed to shift stock. Aston's dealers were getting tired of the things clogging up the showroom. Meanwhile, the Vantage AMR, the introduction of the manual gearbox to the range, did absolutely nothing. I recall a very curious email exchange with an Aston dealer. I was tempted to buy a V8 Vantage because I felt, in the right specification, they could actually look pretty good. And in case you are wondering, my recipe for getting these to look right involved the original grille, which did grow on me, not this later vaned one they introduced as a kind of nod to the old car. It doesn't work when it's this big. It's just daft. And I also thought it was really important to get that little side grille in body matching colour. When it was a contrast item, it just looked a little bit wrong. The rear end of these, unfortunately, there's not too much you can do about it. It's always been a bit fussy, a bit untidy. Compared with that came before, looks like an aftermarket special and not a factory-made Aston. And I think the overall logic with this was that they wanted the Vantage to be the ever more sporty car. And I think that is why, with the sole exception of the terribly, terribly badly conceived and even worse executed V12, all of this generation of Vantage came only with that V8. It's the lighter, more compact, sportier engine, particularly when compared with the then bi-turbo V12 they stuck in things like the DB11 and the DBS Superleggera. And I get what Aston were doing, I really, really do. However, the simple fact was that anybody coming to me who said, James, I'm thinking of buying a new Aston, I've already got an old one, should I? Well, in good faith, I couldn't say yes. Because as far as I could see it, I couldn't really see a reason that you should change. Until, of course, they started depreciating, which didn't take too long. And they got really cheap, and there was quite a bit going for them. As a daily proposition, they were very nice. This 8-speed ZF gearbox is excellent and far better than the robotised manual that you had if you wanted a self-shifting Vantage of old. The boot also is a pretty good size. Heck, even here in convertible form, it's actually really good. And, like I said, over the years, the looks did slowly start to grow on me. And then, last year, they decided to chuck out baby with bathwater and bring in the new Vantage, which looks even sillier, even shoutier, is even broader than this already impossibly wide car. It now has masses and masses of power from a completely reworked version of the 4-litre V8. And though I've not driven the Vantage, I have driven the mechanically very similar DB12. And if the Vantage is anything like that, well, I fear they've ruined it. But there is a little glimmer of hope, because between that car and the new one, we got this. The Aston Martin Vantage F1 Edition. Available as either a coupe or, as we have it here, a roadster, this was their attempt at sharpening the car, making some improvements they saw were somewhat overdue. It also coincided with a bit of a rejig of the Aston range, including a discontinuation of the old AMR. Oh, I nearly forgot. That humorous story I was going to tell you earlier. Well, I went to order a car, spec'd it up, got it up to nearly £160,000, which from 120 grand base price was, I thought, quite a good effort. We then came to looking at numbers and facts and figures and things, and I said, okay, cool, what deals are you doing? And they said, none. What do you mean none? Nothing, not a penny. We will not take any money off this car at all. And with the rate they depreciated, I realised I could then buy my first Ferrari 430 Scuderia, a used car that had a price of some £20,000 more, and it would cost me, with the same deposit, about half what the Aston was going to. In fact, I seem to recall slightly less. So if ever you're wondering why people didn't buy Astons, that's it. Fun fact for you, when I was thinking of changing the Scuderia a while ago, at that I put down £50,000 and I was paying £800 a month. I then looked at a McLaren 675 LT. Now granted, that was a bit more money, that was about £40,000 more. But with the same deposit in, the monthly payment they wanted was nearly £3,500. Yeah. Anyway, onto this. It was the idea of one Tobias Moers, Aston's then new and now ex-CEO, formerly of Mercedes. He saw that the lineup needed a bit of a rejig, but presumably also that the company didn't have much money. So, utilising their then new connection to Formula One, they created the F1 edition. And at a quick glance, it looks a bit like your classic plaques and stripes special. Give it a nice colour like the pace car and the Formula One cars, give it a silly wing at the back because track car, don't you know, some lime green stitching in here, a little plaque down here saying F1 edition, and we all go home in time for tea and lashings of ginger beer. However, all the journalists that drove this car said it was much, much better than that. In fact, this was the car that the Vantage should have been from the off. But what is it that gives me so little faith in my fellow journalists? Well, it's the fact that when you read an article talking about the F1 edition, as I have, they will tell you quite definitively that this is a better car, but not much about how that's really been achieved. Likely in part due to the fact that Aston Martin's PR department has always been uselessly vague. Their website, for example, is currently broken. To try and get any sort of information or photographs out of it is near impossible. How they manage it, I honestly don't know. And yet, they do. Now, what I have gathered is the fact that this has functionally the same engine as the regular car, so still 4-litre bi-turbo in hot V configuration from Mercedes with regular, unchanged internals, but a map, giving it another 25 horsepower, taking the total from 510 up to 535 PS. Torque remained unchanged, but that's fine because the 505 pounds-feet that I had before was already ample. The same goes for the ZF 8-speed gearbox, though the dampers were retuned, being, I believe, a hair firmer, as was the rear anti-roll bar. And it was also gifted a set of wheels that your detailer will hate you for. Now 21 inches in diameter, with 255 section tyres at the front and 295 at the back. The steering was apparently also sharpened, though how, I do not know. Also, not helping matters, and this one's on me, this is actually the first time that I'm driving this car in convertible guise. For which I wish to say a big thank you to its owner, Frank. And he's not the first owner of this car. No, instead, that was the kind of customer that I think Aston Martin believe they have a lot more of. Because he specified himself a DBS Superleggera, but apparently went ham with the options list, going to Q branch and everything else. He was then told, because of this, his car was going to be about 8 months away. And so, to tide him over, he bought this. Did 1,000 miles, lost a bit of money, and then got his DBS. You're welcome. See, horse riders can be lovely people. It's all we need in the world, a bit more of live and let live. And I gotta say, right here, right now, in this car, I'm having a good time. I'm enjoying it. The seats don't really look like all that much, but they're actually quite nice and comfortable. They're also pretty supportive. I was a little bit dubious when I looked at them, but no, they're good. The engine and gearbox also, doing normal, ordinary, boring things, they work fairly well. Naturally, visibility with the roof down is absolutely fantastic, and I'll give that roof mechanism some credit. It can be operated at low speed, but more than that, it's one of the quickest, slickest convertible roofs I've ever seen. And the only soft tops I can think of which might match it would be that in the S2000, which you can't operate on the move, and the manual one in an MX-5, which if you're this car's target audience, you're probably a little bit old to operate anyway, because you don't bend anymore. Oh, and I nearly forgot. I'm sure you've noticed all of the silly aero stuff, which apparently at this car's top speed of 195 mile an hour generates some 200 kilos of downforce. Looks a bit silly though, doesn't it? You could also have the car in just one of 3 colours: white, black or green in either satin or, as we have it here, gloss, which I do like. Unfortunately, when I failed to get the Aston Martin that I wanted, and I keep getting halfway through this story, they said, no, we're not doing a penny off the car you want, but we will give you about 25 grand off a Vantage AMR, the limited edition one. They were only supposed to build something like 200 of, and that was, I think, a year or 2 earlier, and they clearly still hadn't shifted. So that tells you how much of a success that was. I did inquire about one of these. They were available, and they started at £142,000, but you did get a bit more for your money. But I didn't want it with the silly wing, because I'd look like an absolute Burke. And they said, no, sorry, that's how they come. All right then, well, that's a little bit about the car in normal guise. What about when you want to have a little bit of fun? Let's see. I do have a few gripes. Even in its regular setting, which here is sport, the suspension isn't particularly cosseting, but neither is it too punishing. It's very, very taut, and, pleasantly for a convertible, it also doesn't seem to have suffered too much dynamically. Just in case you keep spotting an Emira driving past with a load of cameras attached to it, that's my buddy Ant, who's helping me film today. This engine too. It doesn't have anywhere near the firepower of the later 670 horsepower variant, but what it has is response. Come about 3,000 RPM, and though sure there is a tiny bit of turbo lag, there's not much of it, and what you get instead is more accessible, more engaging and more enjoyable performance. And okay, the 8-speed ZF lacks the bite of a DCT, but it still works perfectly well. These big chunky paddles, which are fixed to the column, not the wheel, they work nicely. I also must give Aston some credit, because they developed a very nice and intuitive method for controlling the car's dynamics. So, on each side of the wheel you've got a little button, the one on the left for suspension and the one on the right for your drivetrain. I've currently got the suspension in Sport. Beyond that you then have Sport Plus and Track, and then on the right I've got the powertrain in Sport Plus, which gives you the pops and cracks. And as it happens, if I were to say anything particularly negative about the car, it's the fact that this exhaust appears to have been designed by Barney Gumble, because it just goes It isn't sonorous, it isn't layered, it isn't intriguing, it's not a particularly great sound, but it is, in terms of volume, fairly well judged. Here in the cabin, I'm not really getting too much buffeting, quite enjoying myself, and the gearing is also relatively short, meaning that it's a car you can work through the revs and enjoy even at modest speeds. Now, another thing that the journalists really liked about these when they came out is the fact that apparently the interior, by some mystical metric, was also better put together than in the early cars, which did have a reputation for falling apart. Not entirely sure I believe that, because in this one, the little passenger footwell light was actually hanging down. The rest of it, though, does feel very nice. The combination of leather, Alcantara, the little bits of green, I like it. And I appreciate the little touches, like the nice leather grab handle in the boot. There are lots and lots of nice Aston-y things in this car. And I wager, if they just made it that this silly screen over here that nobody likes could fold away, like in the old car, people wouldn't complain about it so much. Now, it's not the lightest thing out there. This one will tip the scales at over 1.8 tons, but it still feels fairly keen to turn, the whole thing nicely balanced, These brakes, the regular steels, ceramics being optional, do a very good job. Pedal feel is decent, and the whole thing does feel very, very enjoyable. For the inexperienced driver, it may be a little daunting because you sit quite low, the bonnet is quite high, you can't really see much of it. However, this is not the car for the inexperienced person to buy, so that's fine. I also like the fact that I apparently do seem to get different pops and cracks when lifting off. I also must give it credit because there appears to be very little scuttle shake in here. My camera's not having the best of times, but compared to a lot of other stuff I've driven recently, it's good. Only a few weeks ago, I got to drive the Ferrari Roma Spider, and in terms of pace, I think this is not quite there, but it's darn close. And this is half the money. So then, F1 edition, best V8 Vantage I've driven? Yeah, it probably is. But there is a small issue. These, perhaps because of their reputation, the fact they seemed a bit better loved than the early car, and they're relatively limited, something like 38 Roadsters are in the country, they've held their money quite well. New, you'd be talking about 140,000 pounds for the coupe, a bit more for the Roadster. Now, the cheapest of them is about 120,000 pounds. Whereas the regular car, you can pick one of those up for 60,000 quid. And though I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever in my mind this is a better car, it can't be 60,000 pounds better. And I'm just not certain that in an Aston I want it to be the hardest, sharpest, bestest thing out there. What always frustrated me is that Aston made this and everybody called it the best of the Vantages, for them to not then roll out the improvements across the rest of the lineup. Instead, the whole thing got canned and the new one came out, which, okay, it made improvements that were necessary, particularly to the interior, but I'm not sure it went about it the right way. The DB12 was just a massively underwhelming experience. This is a laugh. I actually really, really like it. And look, this is a bit awkward, all right, so don't tell anybody, but I had an old Vantage convertible, an N400 with a load of Bamford Rose modifications and things. Lovely car. Took it across Europe, did the whole Grand Tour bit with it. I'd never have one of those again. The whole thing is so heavy, the steering is heavy, the gearbox is heavy, the clutch is horrid. It just wasn't a nice or pleasant car to maneuver around town, which, though we try and do as little as we can, sometimes we all have to deal with it. This is much nicer and easier around town, just as much fun out of it. It's still bloomin' quick. And like I say, with the right spec, it's not a bad looking car, you know. I think a much, much nicer one than the new one, which has become almost a parody of what an Aston should be. The fact you can now pick up one of these for 60,000 quid, and parts are likely going to be a bit easier to get to, it's beginning to become a struggle with the older cars, means that, you know what, if I was going to have an Aston again, I'd probably make it a new shape Vantage. Or just get another DBS, because they are just the best looking thing ever. The Casino Royale shape I'm talking about, of course, I'm not mad. But, what do you think? Do you like this? Do you like the wing? Is this the one you'd buy, or would you not? The other problem this car now has is that for, let's call it 135 grand, you could get yourself into, albeit a coupe, DBS Superleggera. Now that's a car I need to revisit. Haven't driven one for a long time, and when I did, it was on roads that were not suited to the car. So if you have one of those and you'd like to see it on the channel, please do get in touch. My email address is in the description of every video. It's talk@jayemm.com. But that for now, I think is it. I wish to say a big thank you to Frank for lending me this and his Emira, and letting my buddy Ant have a go in both. I know he's really enjoyed this, and if you want to see more about what he's got to say, check out our sister channel, the JayEmm and Friends. And I simply wish to end with my classic thanks to all of you. Don't forget to hit that like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.